I want to say that the settlement of the Czechoslovakian problem, which has now been achieved, is, in my view, only the prelude to a larger settlement in which all Europe may find peace. This morning I had another talk with the German Chancellor, Herr Hitler. And here is the paper which bears his name upon it as well as mine. Some of you perhaps have already heard what it contains, but I would just like to read it to you. We, the German Führer and Chancellor, and the British Prime Minister have had a further meeting today and are agreed in recognizing that the question of Anglo-German relations is of the first importance for the two countries and for Europe. We regard the agreement signed last night and the Anglo-German Naval Agreement as symbolic of the desire of our two peoples never to go to war with one another again.
There is a photograph taken at Heston Aerodrome outside London on the 30th of September 1938. In it, a man in a dark suit and a wing collar stands at a microphone, holding up a piece of paper. He is 69 years old. He has just stepped off a plane from Germany. The crowd around him is enormous, and they are cheering. His name is Neville Chamberlain. He is the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, and the piece of paper he is holding in his hand is the Anglo-German Declaration, an agreement he has just signed with Adolf Hitler, pledging that Germany and Britain will resolve their differences through consultation and never go to war with each other. At the aerodrome, he reads it aloud to the crowd. That evening, he stood at the window of 10 Downing Street and told another crowd below what he thought it meant. I believe it is peace for our time. The crowd went wild. 11 months later, Britain was at war. That photograph and those 5 words have followed Neville Chamberlain through history like a sentence he can never finish serving. He has become the shorthand for a particular kind of catastrophic failure. The failure of a reasonable man to recognize an unreasonable situation. The well-meaning fool who shook hands with a monster and called it diplomacy. That reading is not entirely wrong. But it is not entirely right either. And the parts it misses matter. Because if we only remember Munich as a story of one naive old man with a piece of paper, we miss the more uncomfortable truth that Munich was not a mistake made by one man. It was a mistake made by a generation, by exhausted nations, by institutions that had been hollowed out by a war and a depression and the collective fear so deep it had overridden judgment. Chamberlain looked the way he did at that photograph, relieved, triumphant, waving that paper, because millions of ordinary people in Britain and France wanted desperately to believe what he was telling them. He gave them what they needed. He told them the nightmare was over. The nightmare had barely begun. This is the story of the years the world looked away. The story of appeasement does not start in Munich in 1938. It starts in the Rhineland in 1936. By March of that year, Hitler had been Chancellor for 3 years. In that time, he had rebuilt the German military in open violation of Versailles, reintroduced conscription, and told anyone who would listen that Germany intended to reclaim what had been taken from her. He had been watched from Paris and London with growing unease, but no action. Now he wanted to do something that would have seemed, 2 years ago, like it would trigger an immediate military response. He wanted to send German troops back into the Rhineland. The Rhineland was Germany's own territory, but it had been demilitarized since 1919. No German soldiers were permitted there. No fortifications, no weapons. A strip of land along the French and Belgian border was a buffer zone that made France feel safe. And it was guaranteed not just by Versailles, but by the Locarno Pact of 1925, which Germany had signed voluntarily. Taking it back would be the first test of whether the powers would enforce their own treaties. Hitler's generals were terrified. General Ludwig Beck, his chief of general staff, warned him that Germany's rearmament was nowhere near complete, that France alone had forces capable of crushing any German advance. General Werner von Fritsch told him the same thing. If France responded militarily, Germany would be humiliated at best, destroyed at worst. The orders given to the German forces that marched in on the morning of the 7th of March 1936 were explicit. If Allied troops moved against them, they were to retreat immediately. German troops crossed the Rhine with a brass band, and France did not move. France was in political turmoil. A government had just fallen, and the caretaker administration was not willing to act unilaterally without British support. Britain was not willing to act at all. The Foreign Office view was that Germany was, after all, only marching into its own backyard. The public did not want war over a technicality, and the treaty violation, while undeniable, could be rationalised. Versailles had been harsh. Germany did have legitimate grievances. Perhaps allowing this would satisfy Hitler and he would settle down. Perhaps. Hitler had gambled everything on that word. He admitted as much afterwards. The 48 hours after the march, he said, were the most nerve-wracking of his life. If France had pushed back, he would have been forced to withdraw, and the humiliation would likely have ended his political career. France did not push back, and Hitler learned something that would shape every decision he made for the next 3 years. He learned that the democracies would not fight. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Why did they do it? Why did the governments of Britain and France, watching Hitler take the Rhineland, then watching him build towards the next move, allow it to happen? These were not stupid men. Neville Chamberlain, whatever his later reputation, was an experienced and effective politician who had run the Treasury with distinction. The Foreign Office was full of sharp, well-read analysts. They had access to intelligence. They read newspapers. They had read Mein Kampf, most of them, or at least been told what was in it. So why? The answer has several layers, and they are all true at the same time, which is what makes it genuinely hard. The first is one in which we have already touched on by this campfire: the memory of a last war. The men making the decisions in 1936, in 1937, and in 1938 had lived through something that had killed 9 million soldiers and left Europe broken for a decade. That was not an abstraction to them. It was personal. It was the names on the memorials, the men who had not come home, the generation of children who grew up with a particular kind of absence in their houses. No leader in Britain or France could propose another war lightly, or without understanding what another war would cost. The second is military reality. Britain was not ready for war. Its armed forces had been run down through the 1920s and 1930s. The Royal Air Force was in the middle of a re-equipment program that would eventually produce a Spitfire and a Hurricane. But in 1937 and in 1938, it had not yet delivered on its promise. The army was small and poorly equipped. The navy was strong, but a navy cannot stop tanks rolling across the Low Countries. Chamberlain knew that Britain needed more time to rearm, and there is evidence, not the whole story, but a real part of it, that appeasement was at least in part a deliberate attempt to buy that time. The third is ideology. Some of the people around Chamberlain, not all, but some, were not simply afraid of Hitler. They were not entirely sure he was wrong. The idea that Germany had been treated unjustly at Versailles was not a fringe view. It was mainstream. John Maynard Keynes had argued it. Serious historians had argued it. And there was a strain of conservative opinion in Britain that viewed the German nationalists, for all their unpleasantness, as at least a useful bulwark against the real threat: communism and the Soviet Union. Hitler was unpleasant in this view, but perhaps he was manageable. Perhaps a firm enough hand, combined with reasonable concessions, could keep him contained. That calculation turned out to be the most dangerous miscalculation of a century. In February 1938, Hitler summoned the Austrian Chancellor Kurt von Schuschnigg to his mountain retreat in Berchtesgaden. Austria had been a target since the beginning. Hitler was born there. The idea of uniting all German-speaking peoples to a single Reich was not a new ambition. It had been written into Mein Kampf explicitly back in 1925. Austria was the first chapter. Schuschnigg arrived expecting a meeting. What he got was a sustained act of intimidation. Hitler raged at him for hours. He surrounded the meeting with generals. He told Schuschnigg that he had already decided to act against Austria, that the world would do nothing to stop him, that Germany would take what it needed with or without Austrian cooperation. The Berchtesgaden Agreement that emerged from that meeting required Schuschnigg to give Austrian Nazis key government positions, effectively handing his own country's security apparatus to the men who wanted to destroy it. Schuschnigg left and made a decision that took some courage. He was going to resist. He announced a plebiscite, a national vote on Austrian independence. He scheduled it for the 13th of March. He set a minimum voting age of 24, deliberately excluding younger voters who tended to support the Nazis, and he calculated that a clear majority of Austrians, given a free vote, would choose to remain independent. And he was probably right. Hitler could not allow the vote to happen. On the 11th of March, the ultimatums arrived. Schuschnigg must cancel the plebiscite. He must resign. He must hand power to the Austrian Nazi leader Arthur Seyss-Inquart. And he must do all this within hours, or Germany would invade. Schuschnigg stood at a microphone that evening and resigned, asking the Austrian army not to resist what was coming. He spoke calmly, in a voice that people who heard it later described as the voice of a man trying to protect his country's dignity while he was losing the ability to protect anything else. President Wilhelm Miklas refused to appoint Seyss-Inquart. The German Foreign Minister Hermann Göring simply arranged for a telegram requesting German intervention to be sent under Seyss-Inquart's name, without his knowledge. It did not matter. The forms were being observed. The legal surface of things was being maintained, even as the legal substance was being hollowed out entirely. On the morning of the 12th of March, German troops crossed the Austrian border, and they were met by cheering crowds. This is the part of the Anschluss that sits hardest. because it was not only a coup. Significant numbers of Austrians had wanted this, or something like it. The cheering in the streets of Graz and Vienna was not entirely staged. There was a genuine enthusiasm in parts of Austrian society for unification with Germany, for the restoration of something that had been promised by the pan-German movements for decades. There were also many Austrians who were not cheering, who watched the trucks drive past and understood exactly what was arriving. But that is a story for another time. Hitler drove through Austria in triumph. On the 13th of March, the Anschluss was formally proclaimed. Austria ceased to exist as an independent nation. It became the Ostmark, the Eastern March, a set of provinces within the German Reich. Britain and France protested, and did nothing else. A rigged plebiscite held on the 10th of April reported 99.7% approval. Hitler, watching from the cheering crowds, learned the same lesson he had learned in the Rhineland. One more time. After Austria, there was Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia was a democracy, a real one, with a free press, an independent judiciary, contested elections, a civil society that had actually been allowed to develop. It was one of the only functioning democracies left in Central Europe by 1938. And it had something else, a serious army. Well trained, well equipped, with modern border fortifications built into the mountain terrain of its Sudetenland, that some military analysts considered comparable to France's Maginot Line. Nearly 10,000 fortified positions along the German frontier. German military planners were privately alarmed. The Sudetenland was the name given to the border region of Czechoslovakia, where the majority of the population spoke German, about 3 million people. They had been part of the old Austro-Hungarian Empire, and had ended up inside Czechoslovakia's borders when the post-war map was drawn. Some of them had genuine grievances. Some of them had been organised by Nazi agents into political movement. The line between the two was deliberately blurred. Hitler demanded the Sudetenland. He said the German-speaking population were being oppressed. He provided some evidence. He fabricated more. And he threatened war. Chamberlain flew to Germany 3 times in September of 1938. 3 times. He was 69 years old and had never been on an aeroplane before September. He flew to Berchtesgaden, then to Bad Godesberg, then to Munich. Each time hoping that the previous concession had been enough, each time discovering that it hadn't. Each time agreeing to slightly more. At Berchtesgaden on the 15th of September, Chamberlain had agreed in principle to Germany taking the Sudetenland, providing it was done peacefully. At Bad Godesberg, on the 22nd of September, Hitler had changed his demands. He didn't want a peaceful transfer anymore. He wanted German troops in the Sudetenland by the 28th of September. He wanted Polish and Hungarian territorial claims against Czechoslovakia settled at the same time. He wanted the Czechs gone and the German army moving within days. Chamberlain returned to London shaken. His cabinet told him the new demands were unacceptable. The Czechs mobilized. France began cautious preparations. For a brief window, a few days in late September, it genuinely looked like there might be war over Czechoslovakia. And then Mussolini suggested a conference. On the 29th of September 1938, the leaders of Germany, Britain, France and Italy met in Munich. There was no representative of Czechoslovakia in the room. The Munich Agreement was signed in the early hours of the 30th of September. Germany would receive the Sudetenland. German forces would begin occupying it on the 1st of October. Czechoslovakia, presented with the agreement afterwards, was told by Britain and France that it had no choice but to accept. One British official, informing the Czech ambassador of what had been decided, reportedly could not look him in the eye. Chamberlain then asked Hitler to sign a separate piece of paper, a bilateral declaration that Britain and Germany wished never to go to war with each other. Hitler, in a good mood, signed it. Chamberlain stepped off the plane at Heston Aerodrome and read the declaration aloud to the crowd. The paper with Hitler's name on it and his. Then he went to Downing Street. That evening he stood at the window and spoke to the crowd below. "I believe it is peace for our time." The crowd erupted. In the House of Commons, 5 days later, Winston Churchill rose. "We have sustained a total and unmitigated defeat." The chamber erupted too, in anger at Churchill, not at the agreement. The Commons voted 366 to 144 in favour of supporting the government. Churchill and his allies abstained. They did not vote against. They were not ready to break with their own party, even over this. That hesitation is its own kind of human detail. The people cheering in London and Paris were not fools. They were people who had lived through the last war, or grown up in its shadow, and who had just been told that another one had just been averted. The relief was real. The joy was real. Chamberlain, in that photograph at Heston Aerodrome, looks not just triumphant, but exhausted. The exhaustion of a man who has held something terrible at bay for a few more days, and needs to believe that it has done something durable. But Munich did not fail to prevent the war. It made the war worse. Czechoslovakia lost its Sudetenland, which meant it lost the fortifications that were its only real defence. Its army had mobilised, had been ready to fight. It had been told by its allies that they would stand with it. It had been handed over without being consulted, without a shot fired, by the men it had trusted. The Czechoslovak president, Edvard Beneš, resigned and went into exile. The country that had been a genuine democracy, one of the few still standing in Central Europe, was left stripped, defenceless, and alone. German military planners went to inspect the Czech fortifications after Munich. They were impressed. Privately, some of them admitted that a fight for Czechoslovakia, with France engaged on the Western Front and the Czech forces holding the mountain fortifications, would have been extremely difficult, possibly enough to have destabilised Hitler's position at home. We will never know. Munich made sure of that. On the 15th of March, 1939, 5.5 months after Munich, German troops entered Prague. There was no conference this time, no piece of paper, no last-minute flight from London. The Czech president, Emil Hacha, elderly, unwell, out of his depth, had been summoned to Berlin, kept waiting through the night while Hitler watched films, and then confronted in the early hours of the morning with a choice: agree to German occupation and save Prague from being bombed, or refuse and watch the city be destroyed. Hacha agreed. He then fainted and had to be revived by Hitler's physician before he could sign. German troops crossed the border at 6 in the morning. By evening, Hitler was in Prague Castle. The Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia had come into existence. Czechoslovakia had ceased to exist as a nation. In London, Chamberlain condemned it. There was no explanation to reach for anymore. Hitler had taken a country that was not ethnically German, that had no plausible connection to Versailles grievances, that had done nothing except trust the assurances of its allies. This was not revision of the post-war settlements. This was conquest. Chamberlain came, at last, to the conclusion that the democracies had been coming to for 3 years and arriving at very slowly. That appeasement had failed. That piece of paper was worthless. That Hitler would not stop. Britain issued a guarantee to Poland within weeks. Germany invaded Poland. Britain would go to war. The guarantee was real, but Poland was far away. And between Poland and any British help was Germany's own territory. The guarantee told Hitler something important, that Britain was finally serious. And it also told him something else, that he had perhaps 6 months before Poland would be fortified enough, and British rearmament far enough along to make an attack prohibitively costly. He did not wait 6 months. There was a particular kind of moral reckoning that comes with studying the appeasement years, and it does not arrive cleanly. The easy version is contempt. Men in suits in wood-panelled rooms, failing to see what was obvious, choosing comfort over courage, sacrificing a small democracy to buy themselves a little more time. Cowardice dressed up as statesmanship. Naivety that cost millions of lives. The harder version acknowledges that the decision-making was genuinely difficult, that the information was incomplete, that the memory of the last war was not irrational but viscerally, legitimately present, that Britain was generally not ready for war in 1938, that there were serious historians who argue, with evidence, that the extra year of rearmament bought by Munich was essential to Britain's survival in 1940. Both versions can be true simultaneously. Chamberlain was not a fool. He was a man making the best calculations he could in a world that had given him a set of options with no good answers in them. He was also wrong. The wrongness had consequences that dwarfed anything a correct answer might have cost. This is not a comfortable place to sit, but it is an honest one. And honesty is the only thing that makes this history usable. The world that emerges from Munich is not the world anyone intended to make. Hitler wanted a quick war over Czechoslovakia. His generals had tried to talk him out of it, and he had agreed to a conference only because Mussolini had proposed it, and because he calculated that taking the Sudetenland without a fight was a better result than a war he was not yet fully prepared to win. Britain and France had wanted peace and got a worse war later, with a stronger Germany and a dismembered ally. Everyone in the room at Munich got something they did not want. In September 1939, a German armoured column would cross the border for the last time before the world ran out of patience. And this time, there was no conference. Next time, we go to Poland. 1st of September 1939, before dawn, and the lie that was built the night before to justify it. Sleep well. This has been The Sleepy Soldier. If you fell asleep before the end, you were listening the right way. Good night.